Well, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great discussion on tap today. I'm so excited for this one. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of today's webinar, you will be able to access it on demand later on. We'll be sending out an email following today's webinar that will take you to the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time today you have a question for either of our panelists, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And we'll take a few minutes near the end of today's webinar and go through those audience questions. All right, with that, I'd like to go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Leading the Transformation, a panel discussion. Our speakers today, and we have two great panelists, and I hope that they join me on camera. Our first one is Jeffrey Kais, who is the Director of Product Marketing at Platora. Hi, Jeff, how are you?
Morning or afternoon, fantastic.
Awesome. And we also have George Miranda, who's a community advocate over at PagerDuty. Hey, George, how you doing?
Hello, stoked to be here.
Awesome. Well, I want to kick off the conversation, but before we do, I thought you guys both could give us, just tell us a little bit about yourselves, your company, what got you here to today's webinar. So Jeff, why don't you go ahead and start us there?
Well, it's kind of funny. I'm a marketing guy, so you would say you don't really do anything because that's what I used to think. I started my world in programming, and I'll tell you, and as I've watched the DevOps journey, I look at the mistakes and things that go wrong, and I think, well, I did that. I messed that up too. So I'm a really big believer in empathy in the pain because I've done that. I love the journey that's happened, and as I watch companies, and particularly in the enterprise, and that's where Platora sits, is to help enable enterprise on their DevOps journey and digital transformation.
Awesome. And George, tell us a little bit about yourself, the company you work for, and how you got here.
Yeah, so I was an infrastructure engineer for about 15 years or so, managing distributed systems, mostly in the video game and finance industries. I was a very early adopter of AWS, I think in their infant second year of service. And around that time, I really noticed sort of the change in dynamic and the shift towards full stack ownership. It was very clear that operating models were about to change. And shortly after that, I made the transition into vendor life. I worked at Chef Software for a number of years, Chef being one of the pillars of the DevOps movement. And so I spent some time there doing a lot of consulting, did some evangelism work, field events, et cetera. Spent some time in business development, also was a marketing guy in the product marketing side of things for a while. And I think that was kind of a very DevOps move, right? Like I started to go into other silos to lower communication barriers and start to understand other pieces of the organization. So after that, I spent a little bit of time in the Kubernetes and cloud native ecosystem before landing at PagerDuty, where I'm in a community advocate role yet again. So I've also been a contributor to the DORA State of DevOps report for the last 2 years, which I'm very proud of. So I spent a lot of time thinking about patterns that work, metrics that we should follow, the things that separate the wheat from the chaff, right? And I've gotten to work with a lot of different organizations throughout various phases of their own DevOps transformation at different times and like with a different focus, having worked for a couple of different companies in that. So I'm pretty excited to be here and contribute to the conversation however I can.
Awesome. Well, I know the two of you guys together are going to just hit this one out of the ballpark. So I'm really excited for this conversation. Speaking of the conversation, today's conversation is being kind of based very loosely on our latest ebook, which is Successful Scaling: 5 Critical Steps for DevOps Expansion. And business transformation is a huge, DevOps and business transformation almost go hand in hand. So I think whether we're talking about new DevOps implementations or extending or expanding DevOps implementations. I think you know, a lot of what is in this ebook is going to be helpful for any organization that's just looking into or looking to expand their DevOps strategies and tools and technologies. So everybody who has signed up for today's webinar is going to be receiving a link after the event to access this ebook and download it for themselves so that you'll have a copy of it for your very own. Okay, let's kick off the conversation here. And I think probably the first thing we kind of need to talk about is the fact that DevOps transformation is not easy. And, you know, for all the lip service that we've given to, you know, that need to transform the DevOps approach or methodology, you know, it's long, it's an arduous journey. And I think a lot of companies are realizing that if they haven't realized it already. You know, there's a lot of things that can trip you up along the way. And there are a ton of misconceptions that that really, you know, kind of accompany the whole DevOps transformational process. So I, you know, George, I want to start off with you and ask you, you know, what are you, since you're talking with so many customers on a daily basis, what are some of the kind of the more common misconceptions or fallacies that you hear about that are around DevOps?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. I think one of the common tripping points when you first get started is thinking that you're going to see gains overnight, right? And like you said, Charlene, it's completely an ongoing journey. It takes time, and I think one of the things that's most difficult at Chef, we used to call this the operating chasm. Dora refers to it as the J curve of DevOps transformation, right? And you know, J curve is, you know, kind of that curve where you start making some strides, you see a big dip before you start seeing, you know, kind of an improvement in performance and gains. And J curves aren't unique to DevOps, right? We see those in other fields like, you know, medicine, political science, finance, right? I mean, this is a common pattern, but in DevOps, what it means is that, you know, when we first try to transform legacy systems into, you know, newer, automated, more efficient systems, there's a lot of technical debt that we're paying off. There are a lot of skeletons we're bringing out of the closet, right? We're uncovering a bunch of pain. And so it's not uncommon to see a big dip in performance when you're first getting started, right? Like, you start on this journey because you want to get to this brighter future, and what you discover almost right away, and I see this happen across the board, is you get a ton of pain. And that can trip people up, but I think it's important to know that's a common thing that happens, right? And we've even seen that in the State of DevOps report, right? Like, for those unfamiliar, the State of DevOps report looks at performance across web teams. And over the years, it's discovered that there's sort of this natural clumping that occurs, and they've labeled it the difference between low, medium, and high performers. And what we've seen is that medium performers tend to have less reliability than their low performing counterparts. And that's really counterintuitive until you start thinking about the fact that, yeah, you know, you're going through, you're making a bunch of changes, you're trying to learn new tools and new systems, and that's a big tripping point, and it's okay, right? You have to like make your way through that, have to learn the lessons and pay off some of that debt before you start realizing the gains. And so I think if you don't see that clearly, that's definitely going to trip you up, and it can be pretty hazardous to the health of your transformation project.
Didn't you call that the Valley of Woe?
I did. We were talking about that earlier, and that's exactly what
it really is. It's, you know, our customer base is almost, well, it is exclusively the very large enterprises, and it's fun as we talk about digital transformation, DevOps transformation, and you'll get somebody in the room. I remember one of the first conversations I had. We got in the room and they were talking about, yeah, and at the turn of the century, you know, we've had systems around since and processes since the turn of the century. And of course, I'm thinking 2000. And no, they're talking 1900. These companies are so old. When they talk about different systems and practices and so forth, you're talking about a lot of time. Scaling the processes and practices into these organizations is a massive undertaking, not just because you've got legacy systems, but in some cases you've got systems where the originators of that system may no longer even be on the planet anymore. You're not sure where all this sits and how do you transform that. The enterprise also deals with other aspects that maybe cloud native doesn't. You've got off-the-shelf systems. One of our customers, for example, is a large healthcare provider. They've got 9 different instances of a tailored electronic medical record system that they've got to incorporate that has dependencies across the organization, that everything custom they build that links to it, they now have to coordinate with the 8 releases a year that they get of that thing. And so when you look at implementing DevOps practices, a lot of the feedback that we get is, oh my gosh, how do I incorporate that? I'm just trying to keep the lights on. I just have to get, X, Y, Z feature out. And here's yet another methodology. With every, as I heard it put by one executive, with every methodology that I've seen and heard, and DevOps just is another one, it's not like any of the old methodologies just go away. It's not that I stop supporting them. I'm going to now add more, and adding more means that's more to do, and it's going to slow me down. And so why do I believe that this is any different than anything else? And of course, we're like, no, this really is different. This is a new way of thinking and change. It's like, yeah, I heard this before. But so culturally and practice and procedural, it's not just about the automation. It's getting the buy-in all the way from the top down so that you can push that. I think that mentality is changing now that DevOps is turning 10 or has turned 10. I think what we're seeing is that the DevOps practices are moving from it was some shadow IT project and some teams are actually doing it, to now it's being mandated from an executive level down and getting it moving. So what makes that even harder is, of course, the typical command and control. Hey, we're going to tell you how to get this done. We're going to tell you how all the metrics you got to do, and we're going to govern it all the way till you make sure it happens. And that's sort of the anti-pattern of DevOps as well.
Right.
It's really kind of funny as you incorporate all the different technologies and methodologies and experimenting that you've got to do to get there. This is not an easy journey, nor will you ever really arrive. It's a mentality and a culture that you've got to incorporate and get the tools and technologies in place so you can.
Yeah, that's a good point you just made about the fact that you never really arrive. And I think that's actually what puts a lot of people off when it comes to DevOps, the fact that, there is no end in sight, that it's going to be kind of a lifelong journey for them. And I'm not sure culturally how we get past that, but I don't know, that's kind of something to consider.
It's an interesting point, because I had this conversation of, I had one time a person in charge of product say, don't we have enough features? Aren't we good enough?
Right.
And of course, that's part of the culture mentality. I'm sure at one point in time, Blockbuster thought, we're good. We got enough features. We got walk in, you can get stuff done. The world is changing. And if you don't understand that it's changing around you, this is truly a disrupt or be disrupted kind of culture that we live in.
It's a journey of continuous improvement, right? And I think to Jeff's point, you never do fully get there, right? There are always improvements you can make, ways you can connect with your customers more. But one of the things that I think is interesting about the model where we have mandated top-down change is that one of the dangers that I saw early on in the DevOps lifecycle is if you had an internal champion that was really pushing for a new culture, a new way of doing things, and you kind of hit that valley of woe, it was discouraging not to be able to see results, or you kind of need some time to work through the rough spots and really get to that part of the J curve where you're seeing massive gains. And losing your champion, losing the folks that really understand the culture and the shift, I think is a real danger. And I think that's one of the things that makes it really difficult as well, right? If you just have a few folks in your organization pushing, as opposed to your entire team knowing and understanding why these things are of value and where they're going and what they're going to give you, that presents another real pitfall as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, great. Well, so speaking of pitfalls and kind of maybe what you can see and what you can't see in the transformations and expansions, we always hear about, the fact that there are these gains in efficiencies and gains in productivity and advances to the bottom line. But I think that there are certain benefits to DevOps that are not something that you recognize immediately, that they're iterative in how they kind of come into the organization, such that there are benefits that you may not even be recognizing, that they've actually changed your organization's processes for the better, but because it was such an iterative thing, people actually don't even recognize that they're new benefits. But I'd kind of like to hear from you guys. Jeff, maybe you can start us off when we're talking about some of the signs that are there that possibly the organization is doing it right or not doing it right. What are some of the things that you're hearing from your customers?
Well, there's certainly. No, it's a great question. It's like the foundation of doing it right or not, there's certainly some patterns that you can say that are easy to point to and say it is not really working for you. One of the first prospects I ever talked to when I got to Flatora actually told me, hey, we've been doing DevOps for 18 months and we still have yet to ship anything. Mm-hmm. And I had to kind of scratch and go, wait a minute, something's not quite right here. The more that I've met with our customers and prospects, there are some anti-patterns, some ways of thinking that I think are not DevOps, where, for example, Dev says we don't need Ops, or you've got different silos of team, that Dev and Ops are still really siloed, but you think they're automated. Where you've got more DevOps thinks they're gonna, you've got development that doesn't believe they need Ops and that it's just all incorporated. For sure, those, I would call them even anti-patterns, aren't right. The point of DevOps is to leverage the experience and abilities of the team members that you've got in a collaborative way, making sure that it's all integrated with as much stuff automated as possible in its simplest terms. Finding really, from a continuous improvement point of view, those bottlenecks through each cycle and improving that when you're going to go build the product, you're building the engine that builds also the product and getting it out as quickly as possible. That's doing DevOps right. And you'll know when you're doing it right because you'll start having people that care about business discussions versus technology discussions. When you start looking at customer value delivered versus, how many deployments did you deliver?
Interesting. George, what about, when you're talking with your customers or when you're seeing their DevOps deployments, what are some of the things that, I don't know, kind of make you cringe, go, wait a minute, maybe that's not such a good thing. And then at the same time, what are some of the things that you are seeing that, you kind of want to give them a big old pat on the back and say, good job?
Yeah, I would completely echo the last point, which is, making releases on a regular cadence, putting something out, every 2 weeks, doesn't have to be 2 weeks, maybe it's 1 week, maybe it's 3 weeks, but somewhere around there, you work in small batch iterative ways where you can ship some sort of tangible value to get feedback from your customers, even if your customers are, internal consumers of the things that you're creating. I think you absolutely need to do that so you're not working in an ivory tower, right? If it's been months and you haven't shipped anything, how do you have any idea whether or not you're driving towards the right place? So 100% absolutely agree with that. I think the things that stand out to me as patterns that you're doing it right. One of the things that I love about DevOps, one of the things that's very hard about it when you first get started, is that there's not a set of universal things that every organization needs to do. There are some patterns that I think we see repeatedly, and I think the ones that I would call out first are measuring everything, right? I'm not going to get too far into metrics. I think we're going to talk about metrics later. But when you get started, you need a baseline around how your team is performing now, right? If you want to be more agile, if you want to cut releases faster, if you want more reliable services, great. How are you doing that today, right? You can't go somewhere if you don't know where you are, right? So absolutely start with a baseline and then measure everything. Measure more things than you think you're going to need to measure because you're going to come back and you're going to ask questions about things that you didn't know about at the beginning, right? So step one, right? Measuring everything, absolutely. I think that's a good pattern. Doing retrospectives on everything, I think is is a really big thing on a regular cadence. So not just doing postmortems whenever there's an incident and things go wrong, right? But you made a release this sprint, right? You created some demo, some tangible value you put in your hands of customers. Do a retrospective on that, right? Maybe you started working in an agile way from a waterfall method. Start doing retros on the sprint management method, right? And you kind of do all these little mini retrospectives. In the beginning, it actually feels super heavyweight because you're spending, maybe a quarter to half of your time doing retrospectives on how you work more than you're actually working. But it's necessary in the beginning to introduce that culture of continuous learning, right? And then probably the third thing that I would throw out there is having very small incremental plans, right? I think one of the common tripping points for a DevOps transformation is, you want to understand what is the big grand goal, like where are we getting 3 years from now? But you don't want to just have it be an exercise in boiling the ocean, right? You need to be very clear. This month we're going to do thing X, and then next month we're going to do Y, and then we're going to do Z. Don't give somebody the entire alphabet all at once, because then it's completely overwhelming and your teams are going to get lost, right? So I would say those 3 things right there probably kind of answer that, the 2 sides of that coin, right? What should you be doing that works well? And if you're not doing these things, it's probably not going so well.
Are there any red flags that you guys can think of, like, that maybe kind of clue you in immediately that maybe an organization is either in over its head or is missing steps along the way, or, just is not getting it when it comes to DevOps?
Well, for sure, if you're not measuring things, you're not, you can't manage what you not measure. So couldn't agree with that more. From a cultural point of view, you have to be able to have the leeway to run experiments. You've got to have the ability to take some, there's enough written about what is the end state. What do things look like when you're done? There's enough companies out there that have had success, that have started cloud native, that you can draw from. And the question is, how do I get there with my organization? From an executive level, you've got to be able to prove that you're going to be able to take incremental steps there. So don't be afraid of taking an incremental step. I know we're going to talk about that more, but as you have success, that success breeds success. And failures will too, because you can talk about what works and what doesn't. The red flags are when people aren't really caring so much. One prospect, for example, that we just met with, they had their test environment team that religiously every month showed the outages they're having on their physical environments, and how much time was being wasted even in their legacy processes of basically their test environments were unavailable about half of the time that they needed them to be available just to test the process, not even from an automated point of view. Is that really if the culture doesn't care so much about the delivery process that's okay, and there's no ability to improve that, boy, you're not in the right spot. You've got to go fix that. You've got to find a better champion so that you can help move this forward. The red flag typically for us as we go in to help people in their digital transformation is if we don't have the right leader that's pushing, if we don't have the right pioneer that and the right project, you're doomed for failure regardless of what you introduce. So make sure you pick the right project and the right team as probably the most important thing. So biggest red flag for me would be, hey, it's the wrong team, or execs don't care, or and you'll know that because there'll be some telltale signs.
I would add to that. I think it's interesting over time with DevOps. What I think we used to see a lot in the kind of earlier years of DevOps was a lot of grassroots kind of bottom up adoption, right? There's one team that transforms their practices and starts working in these amazing new ways, and they slowly start proliferating their practices out to the rest of the organization. Now with the top-down approach, I think what we do is we get into a place where we get support for the things that we are doing, right? We kind of get that executive sponsor and the right team to be able to push and open doors when we need things to progress beyond just the one team where we're working. I think those things are all really great, but one of the red flags can be, or I guess two red flags that occur in that scenario are, one, when you have a top-down approach, one of the red flags that I look for is sort of a standardized approach to what it is that every team is doing, right? Every team will not operate in the same way. And I think to one of Jeff's points earlier, right? Some of the legacy processes never go away, and you will be managing other bits of technology that won't operate in these new models, right? And if you make everyone adopt the same practices and use the same tool set and not do things that are right for the context of that team, that's definitely an anti-pattern, right? And with the top-down approach, I see that as a common red flag. The other thing that happens is sometimes when you get a little too agile and you don't know what the outcomes are and where things are leading, I've seen transformation projects with some of the customers that I've worked with that have a very short-term scope defined. Like we're gonna, absolutely revolutionize what happens in this one delivery team, and we're gonna get them completely squared away. But then what, right? Well, like which other teams are going to come into the fold next? How do we, define what their objectives are, align those with business needs, and have a pretty solid plan for how we're going to drip this out? You kind of need to think that through and have a really clear plan for what's going to happen, once we measure success, once we see success. One, what is that success? Two, once we get there, what's the next step? And then how do we do things in a way that's right for this new iteration with the new team that we're going to tackle?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right. So that actually is a great seg, because I kind of want to get into the next topic, which is some of the best practices for introducing DevOps or even expanding DevOps. The first one is the idea of becoming a collaborative culture. So George, you just made some really great points, but I didn't hear much about collaboration in that. So what do you see as far as collaboration within kind of the whole DevOps idea and transformational strategy? I know, culture is a huge thing. So, where do you see collaboration as part of that?
Yeah, actually, you know what? I didn't even realize that is a good segue, because I mean, let's step back for a minute, right? What does collaborative culture even mean? Like, how do you know that you have that? You just wake up one day and decide,
It's a
hey,
kumbaya thing, everybody sits around.
I was never collaborative before, but today's the day, right? And so I think culture is a very hard thing to change, right? Like,
Right.
and sometimes DevOps transformation is overwhelming, because you think like, how do I even change the culture somewhere? And so there's a quote that I pulled, and I cannot remember the source right now, but I'll attribute it later. The idea is basically that you can't change culture, but you can change behavior, right? And that behavior eventually becomes your culture. And so I take it a step further, and I say that certain tools enforce default behaviors, and that's what becomes your culture. And so when it comes to driving organizational change, one of the approaches that I've seen work is to talk about that other side of the centralized coin. If you start with a centralized tooling team that can enable development teams to work in a certain way, that has a way of really shifting collaborative culture. So there's a very large clothing retailer that I've done a lot of work with, and their approach was they started by focusing on creating a CI/CD pipeline, right, and making sure that setup was flexible and easy to use. And they did a bunch of enablement work and tutorials and brown bag sessions and documentation, get other dev teams to understand how you do it, right? And that pipeline was very opinionated, right? It always required tests, for any change that was submitted. They were submitted, via Git, which meant that when you created a PR, you needed at least 4 sets of eyes on it to review it, and there was one clear path to production, right? And so all of these things basically made you work in a way that got you to shift away from ad hoc scripts or the manual process that you might be doing, right? It required communication with other teams because of the way that promotion path to production was structured, right? And so it had a way of getting you to understand that as part of your daily work, you need to talk to another team. You have to get input on these changes that you're proposing. And over time, what that's led to with this company is that collaborative culture that folks don't know how to get, right? It starts with those small changes in behavior.
Yep. You know, the first thing that popped out, I totally agree with that. That's the foundation of where things go. An interesting talk that I listened to had a really powerful slide. Neil Barton from Gartner actually had. He was talking about the DevOps birthday, and he put up a chart, and on the chart was a timeline of adoption rate, and he put on three aspects. The first aspect was the adoption rate of Agile, and the adoption rate of Agile. He went back. I mean, it's been around 20, 25 years. Man, we've been talking about this for a long time, and according to Gartner, their recent survey puts at some level about 50% of development, not how many companies, but about 50% of development is doing Agile. He then overlaid the DevOps line, and lo and behold, in 10 years, about 50% of development is now doing some level of DevOps with whatever that means. And again, you have to define it. These are, hey, are you doing DevOps? Well, sure, we've got Jenkins, so we're good. But this is still where people are at. The third overlay that I thought was fascinating is the rise of what they called product-oriented teams. And in the last 3 years, product-oriented teams have now hit 50% of development is in some kind of cross-functional product-oriented team. That's interesting. It's really interesting because the push for collaboration is at the heart of it, meaning that a product-oriented team where you've got cross-functional members from security, from architecture, infrastructure, and development all together to be a collaborative culture is at the heart. The prediction is that over the next 3 years, we should end up with roughly 80% of development being in this cross-functional type team. I think one of the best practices here for becoming a collaborative culture is to embrace that. Early on in my career, when I was a programmer, I remember I got some advice, and the advice was, remember, there's two kinds of companies out there. You got your product because they sell software, and those are product teams, and then you got your IT teams. Forget about the IT teams and enterprise because they're doing the old crap, and you want to be working on the new stuff. And that was the advice I got way back then. I didn't get why, because I didn't really work in the enterprise until later in my career. Now you see it. You see the implications of these cloud native companies outrunning the large enterprise, and thus you see the disruption that you've seen. The collaborative culture changes the story in a very fundamental way. When you have an ops team whose goal is to keep things, they're comped and given bonuses because you kept production up X amount of time. The whole goal behind that is we don't want anything new. New is disruptive. So or dev, and dev gets comped and enabled for how much stuff did you push and how many times, how many packages did you deploy? You don't see there being a natural conflict between those two? The difference being is when you shift into a product-oriented team, the mindset changes, and that mindset is about what did we do for our customer. I have my own prediction that we're going to see the rise of a product manager who's going to become God in this world, because frankly, that's the way it works in product-oriented teams and not IT. And we're going to see this happen where they're the CEO of their product. They know. We're seeing it happen. In fact, was chatting with some folks over at a hotel chain, and they had laid out their product lines. They had a product lines with managers that were driving for, here's your experience people for when you get on site. Here's your booking experience for how you book and bill and so forth. Very much as we've changed the mindset where dev, ops, and everybody else in between starts to think about this as what are we doing for our customer? And that is the fundamental goal. Everything changes with that. And that becomes the weapon that you use to break down silos and walls to say, how are we helping our customers? That's how you become a collaborative culture, by focusing on the value we deliver to our customers. And again, find the right project where that becomes very valuable. And that will help you build bridges between different people and organizations. That will help you build ways of looking at how do we improve across these. But that collaborative nature, you start thinking about with these fully shared responsibilities, like, well, maybe load test could be something we do, as part of the ops is helping out with that piece. Maybe we'll do some tests in production. Maybe we'll dark launch some features and then do some testing on it. Maybe we'll start introducing chaos into production. What a crazy thought is that? Well, yeah, that's our goal. Our goal is to have the best possible experience, and we don't care who, what, how, why. We want to make sure as a team, as a product-oriented team, that's what we do. I think that's the point. So your goal is, if you can change that mentality and focus on the value you're delivering to the customer and start because this is all up to each of us, building those bridges across different teams and people, it's going to happen. So if you're at the forefront, you'll be able to start building that now.
All
There's
right.
one thing I want to add to that, which is
Sure.
100% like shortening the path or shortening the distance between your engineering team and your end users, like the customers driving value. 100%. That is one great way to start getting more tangible feedback about what works, empowering your teams to feel like they can make creative, responsible, valuable decisions with your product, and it's inspiring all around. There's one thing I want to add about silos, because I hear this all the time, that DevOps is about destroying all silos. And in reality, I think especially what we see in larger enterprise teams, the silos are going to continue to exist in some way, shape, or form. I think it's not so much about destroying silos. And Jeff, I'm not saying that you said that at all. I'm saying this is a common thing that I hear from other practitioners.
Yep.
There's a really great analogy that I heard for this. So in math, there's a problem called the goat problem, which more or less is a farm-based thing. You take a silo, which is a big round circle, you tie a goat to one side, and the math problem, is about figuring out, well, what is the maximum area that this goat can graze around the silo? I think that's actually a really good analogy, because what ends up happening in DevOps is that we all still have our own specialties, we all still have our own silos, but what we're doing is we're lengthening that road so we can go see what's happening in other silos and kind of expand our own area beyond our own internal walls to adjacent teams to get a better idea of how they're working, how they influence our work, and how we can work together, right? And so I think that's important to keep in mind when we think about collaboration.
That's a really good point, and I like your excuse me, your customer example as well, because I think when we think about a collaborative culture, I think including the customer in that collaboration, I think, is a very important thing, and that definitely shortens the distance between the developer and the end user. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one here, because we are quickly running out of time here. Yeah, guys. So Jeff, consider failure an opportunity. Go.
You bet. So I'm a marketing guy now, which is kind of funny. And who would ever thought these same kind of principles apply to me as a marketing guy? Well, somebody, of course, we marketing folks, we like to create new concepts and present them. One that was written was called growth hacking. And the basis of growth hacking was experimentation. And that experimentation is a good thing. I would submit experimentation is a good thing wherever you go. We reworked a page on our website, the Why Platora page, and it was kind of funny as part of the process. We are so confident in what we were putting out there, but of course, in the same experimentation, we put it out there and it failed miserably. Not just failed, like really bad. And what was funny about it is we started to analyze some of the results, why, and where people were clicking and what they were looking at. The fascinating aspect is that closed a door on certain concepts. I'd submit to you that closing doors on certain aspects and directions is just as important as knowing which, in essence, you've got only so many doors you can go through and so many paths you can take. By closing some, you learn and you focus your efforts. No longer are you wondering, nor are you betting the farm. These experiments are really, really key in what you do for multiple reasons. One, they're small. Two, there's a goal and a hypothesis of what you're going to look at. And three, when you get all done, you're actually going to look at the results and say, hey, did this work? Did it not? There's an implication that you're going to give a crap of what's going on. That failure is just looking at the results, and it's like it gives you a thumbs up or thumbs down, and it helps guide your direction. You're way more confident when you're going to turn the ship because of failure or success, because you know it worked or didn't work. That is really, really important. Knowing what works and knowing what doesn't is important. There's a danger though in saying, well, what worked here or what didn't work here is applicable across the rest of the organization. No, it doesn't mean that, but there's learnings there that you can take everywhere. And so for me, considering failure an opportunity, has to come from a culture of being able to do experiments and using the results that you find as a way to change direction. As long as they're small, you're not risking a lot.
Good point.
I 100% agree with that. I think looking at the clock, there's a larger discussion here that we can have around organizational culture and ways that you encourage those failures to become opportunities. But I think I'm going to focus on something that's a little more brass tacks and an example that maybe you can wrap your mind around. So one of the things that I love at PagerDuty that we do is we do what's called a Failure Friday, right? And this is leading to some failure injection scenarios. Jeff, earlier you were talking about, introducing chaos into your systems, and it's more or less that, right? I think it's an application of the things that you were talking about. More or less what happens is engineering teams want to understand the failure modes for the things that they are writing, right? And so when they have not seen a particular failure, they sit down and they create a hypothesis around what they think is going to happen, ways that we can monitor it, figure out what's the instrumentation that tells us this thing is going wrong, what is going to be the customer impact. We assemble a plan around that, or we create a team, we create a plan, we assemble a team, and we get together, and at a very specified time during business hours, we'll go ahead and introduce a failure into production. And everybody knows their role and how they're going to respond. And we get to see these things actually happen live to, one, create more resilient systems. Two, sometimes we don't always get it right, and sometimes there's a little bit more of a failure than you would expect. But three, because we do this regularly, because we know what the outcome is going to be, which is we learn something about our system that we didn't know before, because we do this at a regular cadence in a structured way and we get organizational buy-in, we start creating a culture where that sort of experimentation and that failure is seen as an opportunity, even when it happens when we didn't expect it, right? When we didn't structure it, because this is what we do, right? We take failures and we learn from them. And you have to create space to do that, and you have to create an opportunity for it to feel safe to do that, right? And so that's just a habit we form over time.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. That's great. Okay, doing a quick time check. We're about 22 minutes, maybe no, 18 minutes to the top of the hour. Sorry, math. So I'm gonna move on to the next one here. Know your customer value. George, this one, I actually am having a little bit of a hard time wrapping my brain around this one. So what do you think this means? And hopefully it'll enlighten me in the process.
I think this is something that I see happen a lot with some of the engineering teams that I've worked in. It's hard sometimes to understand what is the value that you're really providing unless you have a very short path to the customer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's a little abstract if you don't immediately have that customer feedback. And so I'll give you an example, right? Sometimes, in a consulting engagement, I would do something like, figure out ways that you could scale parts of your infrastructure and help you do that to accomplish some goal, right? But when presenting to internal stakeholders around, the thing that we've created or, the value that we're delivering, I'll hear a statement like, well, now with this work, we can deploy Apache web servers 5 times faster than we could before. And like, okay, well, I mean, that's great, but my company doesn't sell Apache web servers.
Right.
Like they sell convenience when grocery shopping, right? Food magically appears at your door. And so your value is not that Apache web server, right? Your value is the reliability that you created because that service is available, right? The agility that you have to shift and grow workloads depending on how traffic is coming in, right? And the safety of knowing that when you create that transaction, it's going to be completed, the food's going to arrive at your table, right? And so I think connecting those dots sometimes is really the key part here, right? A lot of times we, some of the projects that we take on, we know how this improves things, but just the way that we frame it, I think, again, having that mindset where you're product oriented, right, and you're thinking about the end user experience really helps here. Because I think a lot of teams intrinsically do this. It's just that little extra step of connecting those dots in a way that's relatable. That's really
Yeah, so I agree with you. And when I say I was having a little hard time wrapping my brain around it, I understand the concept of it. But I think I see well, I know I see teams that are so hyper focused on what their job is that they're maybe you're right, maybe they are kind of putting two and two together in their mind, but that's not what they're expressing when they're talking about what they're working on from a project standpoint. It's more, I am getting my servers to run faster or something
Right.
like that, and I consider that my job. It's my job is not to make sure that the customer can order butter 6 times faster by clicking on this button. It's for them it's all like IT, it's all hardware, it's all software. It's not what does the customer need at the end of the day. So I think that is definitely a good point to make when we're talking about making sure that everybody understands what their role is with the customer.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. It reminds me, to pick on the U.S. government, at one point in time, the Social Security Department, they decided to post, they were supposed to get disability forms available online. And they did exactly that. They took all their forms, made PDFs, and put them online so that people could download them, print them out, and fill them out and put them in a mailbox. Isn't it crazy when you think of, well, I want to fill out some information and get it to an organization? Can you imagine if that's how you signed up for email, is that you downloaded a form? And I think the point of the Platora value stream management platform is to rethink how you deliver value to your customers so that you can become customer centric and think of the customer journey and the problems they're solving. The point that you can do today is, if you do a value stream mapping exercise, which anybody can do, go take it sometime and just put the sticky notes on the board and run that. It's from the customer perspective, and it forces the very first discussion, which is, what is valuable to the customer? Is it truly the fact that we've got this many deploys a day, or our MTTR is this? I mean, sure, they're related, but optimize for that.
That's not what the customers are looking for when they're shopping around. So yeah.
Yeah, well, and especially if we're, again, how do we motivate people? We give them bonuses, and we've got all these performance indicators.
Right.
If that's how we're going to motivate them, we should really look at that.
Yep. Yep, I agree. Okay, moving rapidly along here. Measure the right things. George, you talked about this earlier. So, Jeff,
Well,
what are your thoughts on it?
we just kind of jumped into that, didn't we? It was kind of funny.
Yeah.
Is the customer value MTTR? Is it deployment frequency, defect frequency? Is it what really is? Another analyst report that I was reading showed that the average frequency of deployment still across the enterprise is about once a quarter. Is that a measurement of value? I mean, these companies are successful. It might be. Um, those things are interesting. I think in order to get to measuring the right things, you have to look at doing a value stream mapping exercise is probably the easiest one. And it's a really simple process. It doesn't have to take days. A couple of hours, sticky notes across. Some key things you can look at to know how well you're doing wherever you are is look at things like your lead time. How long does it take for an idea, once it's approved, to go from that idea to into production? If you want to know the value of that, if you're a traditional PMO kind of organization, all those ideas already have a value assigned. That's how the budgets got approved. And you can say, well, okay, now I can measure how long it took there. Take with that lead time and look at how much time was actually spent between the calendar time of delivery to compared to the actual amount of time was spent working on it. That's a really easy calculation, because whatever is different between that, that's your waste. And that's the point of doing a value stream map. One other aspect I would say to look at, for sure, if you look at how do you, you delivered your product, and it's out there in production, how do you know that you were successful? Is it because you didn't bring down production? Is it because, you deployed so many story points? Is that really the measurement of success? I'd submit maybe look at customer adoption, look at a net promoter score, mix that in with the features there. Can you measure actual ROI? There's really cool things that are beyond just simple dev metrics that don't take a lot to incorporate, that are, even if you're, thumbnail it and see where you're going to end up, there's value in doing that. So measure those things because they're going to be valuable. when you mix that then with the other interim metrics, such as your deployment frequency and all those things are going to be very interesting. How long did it take to design features? What's my work in progress? What's my environment provisioning time? How long did cutover and deployment take? And you start looking at these other areas, you're going to find a vast wealth of things for where it's an opportunity-rich environment to improve. So finding those things and starting with that customer value, I think is key. And then you'll be able to know exactly what you want to measure, because you're going to measure more specifically on the areas that you want to improve and then show the improvements.
The only thing that I would add to that, drilling down a little bit deeper, is that customer value, right? Those outcomes tend to be centered around what are lagging indicators, right? If we did our job right, well then, our customer was able to order butter faster, right? To go back to an earlier example. But there are leading indicators, and those leading indicators are more things that you can affect on a day-to-day, right? So the things that you were talking about, your mean time to deployment, right? You want to make that better. What's the percentage of repos that are connected to a CI/CD pipeline, right? What percentage of teams are submitting tests with all of their changes so that they can, get through a pipeline faster in a rigorous way and make it to production reliably? Those are the kinds of things that you will want to measure as an IT manager. And so here's what I would say. There are a bunch of leading indicators that you can center around, right? And behavioral things that you want to encourage to drive that lagging indicator. Here's the real manager kung fu that you need to wrap your mind around, right? Is that you basically need telemetry around as many of them as you can. Like you need to see what all of these behaviors are. But your job as a manager, separating the wheat from the chaff, is trying to figure out, well, which ones are the problem for my team, right? And you may have 50 different metrics that you're looking at, but your team, they need to focus on 2 or 3 of those behaviors, right? What are the highest impact ones? They're going to make a difference to that outcome. I think my experience as an engineer is like, I appreciate that clarity when I'm on a team. And I think as a manager, you need to do that. Otherwise, it's overwhelming and it's too much, right? So it's the only thing that I would add to the things you were saying.
All right, great. I don't mean to hurry us along here, but we've got 8 minutes until this webinar is over. We're still doing the best practices. So I want to just dive into the last one, which is embed and engineering rigor. And I know this means different things to everybody. So George, why don't you tell us what you think this means, and then Jeff, you can have your crack.
Yeah, I'll give you the short version, right? So I think a lot of teams tend to focus on tools and infrastructure, right, for a DevOps transformation, and you need to. But embedding an engineering rigor, I think, also means identifying the gaps and the inefficiencies in your process, right, and getting better at those, right? Again, putting a bunch of instrumentation in places. So telemetry is your friend, right, and not just observability and practices, but application observability as well. Right? And then thinking about user experience, right? Some of the things that we talked about earlier, I think what it means to embed an engineering rigor is to realize that all of these bases have to be accounted for, and it's your responsibility to make sure it's everyone's responsibility on the team, right? You need to take that approach of looking at some of the meta related principles like telemetry, instrumentation, and user experience, and make sure that everyone on your team gets a chance to focus on that, realize that it's a part of their job, and it's not just about creating the tools and the infrastructure.
Couldn't agree more with that. The way I like to think about that is from a product point of view, that in a typical manufacturing process, you're going to build a manufacturing engine and then you're going to run widgets through it. Software ain't like that. With every single product that's delivered, you've got to build the factory that builds that product and ships it out. As a product owner or as someone who's driving the product, I think there's sort of 3 different kinds of areas that you should be looking at, or features that you're going to go build from an engineering perspective. And that would be simply, here's the features I'm going to build, the factor that it takes to build it, and what I'm doing to get rid of the technical debt that was behind there. And you need to figure out what the balance is between those as you go, because that factory spans the entire existence from the ideation all the way into production. And how do you improve it? Each release ought to look at the measurements and the amount of improvement from before.
All right, great. Okay, we're 6 minutes. So we have one more topic we need to go over real quick, which is some of the best practices for advancing or extending DevOps initiatives. And guys, I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds each basically to go through this, and because I want to give us enough time to get at least one question in. We've gotten a lot of really great audience questions. So Jeff, why don't you start us off? 30 seconds, go.
You bet. Best practice is just start. It doesn't matter. You've heard a lot of tidbits. You've heard a lot of these different things. The best practice of getting going is just getting started, finding and having successes, or finding a failure and promoting the failure as a closed door. That's okay. The whole point is to initiate a thinking of and a culture of experimentation and moving that forward. That's where, again, this is where tools like Platora come in to help you manage and deliver on wherever you're looking to make those changes. We'll give you the visibility and show you the bottlenecks in the process.
Awesome. George.
All right, 30 seconds for ways to get started. Again, I'm a big fan of metrics. Measure everything. That does not mean you pay attention to everything. Gather the metrics, but be very clear on which ones actually matter to you and focus only on those. Iterating on some of the things that Jeff said, right? I think practice is important. So again, some of those postmortems on new process, not just incidents that occur, but new ways that you're managing your team, new things that you tried, having a lot of time to review, pull lessons, and reintroduce those back into the org, absolutely key. Creating opportunities from failure, again, practice, right? Set up an opportunity to introduce failures in a structured way, be clear on where you're going to be pulling from them, and when you get into a cadence where you see that those things can benefit the org, that has a way of becoming your culture over time. So again, just practice those things, ad infinitum, what's the word I'm looking for? Just do it again and again and again, right? And that is
Excellent. All right. So we have about 4 minutes to do maybe one or two questions. So we're going to go ahead and dive right on in. The first one, what does the right champion / leader need to possess? Do they need to possess passion, knowledge? I mean, what makes the right champion or leader in your minds?
Well, that's probably one for both of us. I'll take a swing at that one. Um, I, what we've seen, the right champion, one is a leader in the organization. They're respected. They've got key thing influence. They can influence across organizations, not necessarily across the line of business, but within that area, they can pull together different people to help them focus on value. Two, they typically have some ability to influence budgets so that they can influence the tooling, they can influence decision making as it goes forward. Three, they're in an area where it is a business critical or business important function, so that when they talk customer value, it actually matters something to the business. You put those three things together and their involvement with a delivery pipeline, and it matters, and they will have the right influence.
I think that's absolutely key. You need that sort of executive champion and leader to push your project along. I think on the practitioner side as well, one of the things that folks have to just go for is enthusiasm, right? Like you love this new way of working or this product or this thing, and that's great. But I think it also really needs to be tempered with compassion, right? Because what happens is when you go down a path of working a certain way, you need to teach others. You need to work with folks that maybe are entrenched in a methodology or a tool or a problem that is very different from the one that you're solving. So being able to relate to them, understand what their needs are, and then frame things in a way where you kind of bridge those divides is absolutely key in what you need in terms of a technical practitioner champion as well, right? And that passion that you want really is not a passion about DevOps or methodology or tool. It's really about a passion for improvement, right? So I think like that's really what you need in that boots on the ground champion.
Yep. Well, and what's funny about that is that it feels like the biggest killer of DevOps is the governance. We must command and control exactly what happens. That champion ought to be the champion of governance, and that's where reaching across and pulling your change advisory board, your security folks, and getting they're the ones that are going to pull the team together to say, hey, look, this isn't, you know, an isolated area. We're going to pull everybody together to make sure that we're all engineering this in.
It's a lot more of you know, making with the words and the talkie versus right? Like that's what ends up happening. So yeah, you need to
Okay.
be.
All right. Well, we are less than a minute until the end. Oh, there's 2 o'clock. So we need to close things out now. If we didn't get to your question, I apologize. Just know that George and Jeff are both getting a copy of all the questions that came in. So I'm sure they or somebody from their organizations will be more than happy to get back in touch with you and get your question answered. Just a quick reminder that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, that's cool. You will have the opportunity to do so. We are going to be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. The email also will contain a link to access the ebook that we discussed during today's webinar. The webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always find it there. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it will be right there waiting for you. George, Jeff, thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure. We always have great conversations, and I know I got a lot out of it. So thanks so much. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks, both of you. It was great.
Thanks, guys.
All right. So this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.